Hey everyone, welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I'm joined by four-time CFL Grey Cup Champion, Tim Fleiszer. Born and raised in Montreal, Tim grew up with two dominant environments, medicine and sports. His mother was a child psychologist, his father was a trauma surgeon. On the sports side, his father was an accomplished university athlete and the physician for the Montreal Canadians and Alouettes. A multi-sport athlete, Tim chose the athletics route and eventually landed on football as his path to professional sports. After a decade in the CFL, he decided to move into the world of consulting and sports management. In his post-football journey, he committed some of his time to the US-based Concussion Legacy Foundation to help his friend and founder, Chris Nowinski. When the foundation expanded to Canada, Tim took on the role of executive director. In addition to looking at the effects of concussions on athletes, the foundation has started Project Enlist in Canada to look at service-related concussions on our military personnel. Before we get to our guest, a quick word from my friend Eleanor Taylor, the Manager of Community Engagement and Advocacy for the True Patriot Love Foundation. She's going to talk about the Veteran Volunteerism Initiative.
Veterans bring a vast array of skills and experience from their military service that could strengthen community organizations across Canada who are in desperate need of volunteers. While other nations have explored the connection between volunteerism and veteran well-being, Canada currently lacks such research. True Patriot Love's Veteran Volunteerism Initiative, funded in part by Veterans Affairs Canada, seeks to address this gap. Through our research, we aim to demonstrate the mutual benefits for both veterans and civil communities when veterans are actively recruited into local volunteer organizations. Veterans who want to support this initiative can volunteer with one of our inspiring partners who are joining us in this work. They are Team Rubicon Canada, Camp Aftermath, Veteran Farm Project, Mood Disorders Society Canada, Big Brothers Big Sisters Toronto, Invictus Games 25, and Pearly Health. Join us in strengthening Canada through veteran volunteerism.
And now, my friends, here's my conversation with Tim Fleiszer. Tim, thanks so much for being on the podcast, and I also have to give a shout out to KPMG for hosting us here today in their offices. So thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and always a pleasure to be here in Ottawa, and set foot in these gorgeous KPMG offices.
And you were just up on the hill. So what brings you to town before we kick into your family history and background?
So trying to get support from some of the members of Parliament for looking at both brain injury legislation. There's a private members bill that's going to be put forward, Bill C-277, that's going to look at a national brain injury strategy. And so we're very supportive of that and want to help wherever we can. And then looking at a day on the Hill in May to try and rustle up support from current sitting members for the work that we're doing.
Awesome. A day on the Hill. That sounds like an awesome idea. Yeah, I think, and we'll get into this in the sort of the latter half of the conversation, but I think those visual representations, those chance for people to actually come out and show their support as opposed to online, like those are important. Doing both those things is really good. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that looks like. That's awesome. Family. Always kick off with talking about people's families, and then we talked previously. I have a pretty decent idea about your two sides of your family. Maybe let's start. I like the onion cart story with your grandfather, but maybe talk about your father's side of the family and starting off with your grandfather.
Sure. So my grandfather was born in Poland in a town called Luck, and when he was 17, the German tanks rolled in, and unfortunately we lost most of that side of my family. When that happened, it just so happened that on the day that those guys came in, he was wearing his cadet uniform. So rather than getting sent to the death camps, he got sent to a military camp in Siberia and was able to escape. Ended up on an onion car on a train, and hid in the onion car and ate onions for 2 weeks till he got back, and then ended up part of a expat Polish squadron that flew for the RAF.
Yeah, that's really cool. I was just watching Masters of the Air on Apple. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's worth a watch, because that sort of air battle was really significant in the war effort. What did he do after that?
So he did a number of different things. While he was over in the UK doing his training, he met my grandmother. And so my dad was actually born in the UK, and they came over when he was very young. And my grandfather started as a dishwasher over here and had a number of different careers, including being a draftsman. He worked significantly in defense as well. As a contractor for years. I remember as a kid seeing his pamphlets lying around, and very fond memories of him taking me to the War Museum here, which I think a lot of people have had in their families. And was just a great guy, very entrepreneurial in his thinking, very innovative, very loving and supportive. And he passed away 3-4 years ago now. Okay. Yeah, but was happy he got to meet my 2 older boys, and that's awesome. It was really cool.
And how about your grandmother?
So my grandmother, just she's kind of the embodiment of the British stiff upper lip. She was a big fan of Maggie Thatcher, to give you a sense, and she was certainly an Iron Lady in her own right. Very, very tough woman, but wonderful. I had a wonderful relationship with my grandmother. Very interesting, a big influence in my life. I mean, it's anytime you're ever feeling sorry for yourself, it's you can think back to my grandma and think about what she'd have to say about whatever the situation was, and she's very, very, very motivating to have a grandma like that.
Did she ever share any stories about sort of what made her that tough, and why she you said she liked Maggie Thatcher? I mean, there's a great example of what makes somebody the way that they are. Why are they so tough? Why are they so resilient? Well,
she talked about when the bombing raids would happen. And she'd be in school, and they'd put on these Mickey Mouse gas masks that they'd have, and climbing under their desks. And I think, likely when you grow up in that environment, there's not a whole heck of a lot of place to feel sorry for yourself. It's you get up and get on with it, and that was very much her attitude. And I think there's certainly a place for that.
Yeah, and I think that shared experience too, where if you're in the Blitz in London and you're looking around and everybody else is in the London Underground bomb shelter, I mean, who are you complaining to?
That's exactly it. Yeah. And that I think embodies her and embodies her spirit, and we could do with a little more of that these days.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So that's your dad's side of the family. How about your mom's side of the family?
So my mom's side, Alberta farmers. My grandma was from a place called Berry Creek in Alberta, and my grandfather was over near Drumheller. And they met at a skating party and started dating when they were in Edmonton. My grandmother was working as a neonatal nurse at I think it's the Royal Alexander. I used to drive by it every day when I was playing in Edmonton on my way to practice. And they talked about going for dates at the Bob Inn.
The Bob Inn?
The Bob Inn in Edmonton. And my grandfather, after he graduated from University of Alberta, was working as a spectrologist and ended up in northern Quebec in Arvida, where my mother was born. And they also led very, very interesting lives where they were over in Egypt for a year. And my mother and my aunt and my grandfather and my grandmother talked, had very fond memories of going over there, and getting to be immersed in another culture, I think was very interesting. And then they came back, ended up in Montreal, and later in their lives they were travel agents.
Really?
And got to travel all over the world. And again, very, very influential in my life. My grandfather would drive me. Both my parents are physicians, and we're often very busy. And so I'm kind of getting into that stage now with my own kids where you basically turn into an Uber driver.
Yeah.
And that was my grandfather for me, driving me around from practices when my parents couldn't always come into games. High school, college, the pros. One of my great memories for those guys was when we won the cup in Vancouver when I was playing with Edmonton, and the crowd actually lowered them to come on the field right when we had won, and the big smile on my grandfather's face was amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So did you? It sounds like you were fortunate enough. Did you know all four of your grandparents?
I did. I was
That's
for the
awesome.
longest time. I was one of my only friends that had all four of their grandparents. My grandfather lived to his early 90s, and this is on my mom's side, and my grandmother lived to 102, and my grandmother and grandfather on my dad's side lived to 96 and 97. So I certainly got some longevity genes.
Yeah, I was very fortunate that the only grandparent who I didn't really know was my paternal grandfather. Died when I was in grade 5. But all of my other grandparents lived, well into my adulthood. With my grandfather just dying, probably the one I was closest to, probably about 5 years ago. It was 98, I think, and just such an amazing life experience to have those people around you. And I think I have a real reverence. I say this, I don't mean it pejorative, but sort of elderly people. I really enjoy spending time with people with that sort of depth of life experience, which is why I think World War II veterans, not a lot left anymore. It's so important if people haven't had a chance to sit down and talk to some of those folks. You just learn so much from people's lives, which is kind of the part of the reason this podcast, I think, is so important. Is we may not think we have a lot to share at our age, but you really do. You can glean a lot from other people if you give them the time to actually sit down and tell a story more than 2 minutes.
They talk about the greatest generation, and I think for those people that grew up during the Depression and then lived through the Second World War, I think there is a resilience that those people showed that, again, I think is something that we should look at very long and hard today, and the way that they were able to deal with adversity and overcome adversity. And I think there's some great lessons there for us.
Now, you're mentioning that both your parents are physicians, and when we talked earlier, you said that they had met at medical school. Yeah. So what happened sort of after they met, and how did the family end up in Montreal, which is sort of where you spent your formative years?
So my dad was playing football at McGill, Heck Creighton Trophy winner for most valuable player in Canadian college football, the only guy that ever won it from McGill still to this day. And
so this is the Canadian Heisman, effectively.
Basically, it's the Canadian Heisman. And yet what he talked about so much growing up was his disappointment of getting to the national championship game and losing.
Yeah.
And my mother at that point was a medical student, and they ended up as lab partners. And from there started dating and got married, and I was born a year after.
What was your childhood like in Montreal?
Magical. It was. I had a wonderful childhood. I was very fortunate to have parents that I think had and grandparents that had an understanding of development that was probably ahead of the times in terms of exposing me to just a number of different experiences. My dad never put any pressure on me to play sports in any kind of way, despite his background. I certainly felt that pressure from the rest of the world, but never from him. And my mother was incredibly insightful about things like hydration and nutrition and things, and my grandmother as well. She was always a huge proponent of nutrition. I think we're just like way ahead of their time.
Now, you say there was no pressure. to play sports. You were immersed, though.
Absolutely. It was. So my dad at that time was a doctor for both the Alouettes and for the Canadians, and so I was fortunate enough to grow up in those locker rooms, like in and around it, and around McGill football. He was doing that as well. He was part of that physician group at the Montreal General Hospital that included Dave Mulder and Doug Kinnear and Ray Brown, these legendary, Eric Lenzner, who operated on me several times. This legendary Montreal group of physicians that, as somebody who's, was able to deal with a lot of medical staffs on a lot of different teams and have through a lot of my career, they really are and were a special group. And, so very fortunate to be around those guys on the medical side, but also very fortunate to be around a Montreal Canadians team that won a couple of Stanley Cups. And I think when you're exposed to that and around that as a kid, there's things that you just pick up by osmosis that you can't necessarily teach.
If you look back on it now with a little bit of hindsight, do you think there was really ever going to be another path that would have made you happy?
Well, it's funny. My grade 2 teacher, well, there's a couple of things. One, when I was a little kid and my dad would take me to the ICU when he was on call, and again, funny when you look at things through the lens of today as a parent, it's like, what do you do with your kids, right? And so my dad, when he would get called and the beeper would go off as a trauma surgeon, he'd, I guess, just bring me along. And so I remember him putting me at the nurses' station in the intensive care unit, and the nurses were great. They'd come in and they'd give me milk and cookies and that kind of stuff. And they'd always say, "Are you going to be a doctor like your daddy?" And when I was very little, I'd always say no. And I'm the only non-medical person in my family. Both my parents are physicians. My sister's a PhD nurse, and my wife's a psychotherapist, all McGill trained. And so certainly immersed in that, and definitely immersed in sports as well.
Now, what sports did you play as a kid?
Anything and everything. This was back in the days of the Expos heyday, so I would wear my full Expos uniform to school and was convinced that I was going to play for the Expos. Signed a tennis ball and gave it to my grade 2 teacher and said, "Hang on to this because it actually may be worth something someday."
That's bold. I like that.
Well, I was very, very driven in my own mind. I was going to be an athlete, and that was going to be my career path. So back to your original question, that was absolutely, from the time I could remember what I wanted to do, and so that. But I'm a huge proponent of that. And again, there was never any pressure to play one sport versus another, and so. Soccer, basketball, touch football, baseball, hockey, every sport under the sun, and I'm a huge proponent today of kids being multi-sport. When you look at some of the data, one of the issues with our sport development programs these days is trying to get kids to specialize too early. I think the pressure on it, particularly for really little kids, like the kids that are my kids' age. I mean, what's most important at that point is not training them to be, NHL or CFL athletes. It's you want them to have fun and you want them to fall in love with sport and fall in love with exercise. And I don't think we do anywhere near a good enough job of that. And I think it's also important that we emphasize multi-sport, because you never know what sport is really going to trigger a kid's passion. I mean, I started wanting to be a baseball player, and then it was going to be hockey, and ultimately ended up, as a 17-year-old, hockey was still my main sport, and ended up at the very last minute making a decision to play football. And so I think, as we think about long-term athletic development strategies, I think having that space for kids to explore, play different sports, try different things, and figure out what their passion is, and realizing that, just like happened with you and I, that's going to change multiple times in your life. And whether your career is in sports or in medicine or in anything else, giving yourself that space and flexibility to be able to pursue what it is that you're passionate about.
Did you have a first love of sport? And we talked about this before, because I think Wayne Gretzky's told the story over the years that his first love was always baseball. And despite being, arguably the greatest hockey player of all time, like he still reflects back on that as saying his first love is baseball. Doesn't, obviously it doesn't take away from anything he's done, clearly. But did you have a first love of sports as a kid?
Like I said, through my teenage years, I saw myself going to play hockey. And when I went down to Choate Rosemary Hall, which is a prep school in Connecticut, really strong football program there, but also really strong hockey league. I mean, multiple, just a ton of NHL guys come out of that league. Very, very competitive. And when I went down, it was more with the idea of I'm going to play hockey and, figure out a way to make it to the NHL. And it was a very last-minute decision. Football was sort of an add-in at that point, and it was a very last-minute decision to choose football instead.
How did you end up going from Montreal to Choate?
So it's interesting. There must have been some sort of scouting service or something where like one of these schools find out about you and then they all find out, because all of a sudden started getting all these letters in the mail. And the way they used to do it back then is they would send you VHS tapes. And so you put in these VHS tapes and you see these New England prep schools, and the facilities are like universities. Like you sort of you watch the video and you can't believe it's real.
Right.
And so we drove down and we went and visited Hotchkiss and we went and visited Choate. And I've had this experience many times in my life where when I stepped on the Choate campus, it was like, if they let me come here, like, where do I sign? And, unbelievable school. JFK went there. Just tons of really prominent alumni that have come out of that school. And it's for good reason. It's a magical place.
It's and I think you'd made the similar comment about when you stepped on the Harvard campus about the feeling there. It's a great message. I mean, I just went through the process with my daughter about getting her, ready for university and visiting campuses. And everything pitches well, especially now in the internet age. And it was probably similar with a VHS tape, right? Like it's going to be well produced and you look at it. But until you actually walk the ground, that's a different thing altogether.
There's something to it. And I had a bad experience at Hotchkiss, but it just sort of didn't feel right. And I had very similar experiences at Yale and at Princeton. I was there 20 minutes, half an hour, and it was like, I just don't think this is for me. Like for whatever reason, it just didn't fit. And so, back to the trying different sports and trying different things. It's sometimes you have to be there and just be in it to really get a sense of whether it's for you or not.
So was the goal of going to Choate to be able to, as a springboard into U.S. college sports? Like what was the intent about taking that step? Yeah,
so absolutely. I mean, it's a feeder school, the Ivy League. They had alums that had gone on that had played in the NFL, that had gone to some of the other big football schools. It was a great hockey school that had put, again, a number of alums in the NHL, and the academic reputation is it's just one of the top schools in the U.S. And so you get a chance, you just don't say no.
Right.
Yeah, but absolutely, it was it was a springboard, and it just seemed like it would open up a lot of options, and it certainly did.
Was that the first time you were away from home for a significant period of time?
Yeah, and that part was phenomenal. And Montreal was great, and getting to go to a Selwyn House in Montreal, which is another, absolutely terrific school, and had great sport experience there, and great academic and school experience. And listen, Montreal's a fun city. And it was a fun city to grow up as a teenager, maybe too fun, right? You get exposed to a lot in Montreal, and going from that to rural Connecticut where, you had a 10 o'clock curfew, and, you had to get teacher permission to have a girl in your room and all this stuff. I mean, that was a big shock from a culture standpoint. But it was very positive at that time in my life. As a 17-year-old, there's a lot of temptation out there for things that can definitely take away from your focus. And I was very thankful for that for Choate, is that you had this contained environment that was really facilitated and encouraged focus. And so in some ways I knew it was a sacrifice where, and sort of held on to this through college, is, it wasn't going to be quite as fun as maybe some of my other friends were having. It wasn't quite the same party, but that I felt like it was going to be something that was going to get me to where I wanted to go in the long term. And the deal I made with myself was that if I ever made it, it would make up for the lost party on the back end. And so once I got to the CFL and the pros, that definitely, it made up for it.
Right. Now, what was the recruiting, or what was is it called recruiting, NCAA recruiting? Yeah. So how did that so you already sort of went through a little bit of it with Choate in selecting there, but I imagine it's sort of that on steroids when you're talking about the NCAA. I mean, this is a big deal.
And because I was multi-sport, it was even more so. So the way it works is you show up and you start playing. So you have your football season, you have your hockey season, and then you come back from the holidays in your junior year and you just start getting all these letters. I mean, nowadays it's all automated. You get emails, or I think they do a lot of direct messaging on social media, actually, is the way that the recruiting process worked. But back then it was you get letters. And so you just start getting letters from, all these schools that you had watched on TV as a little kid, and all these legendary coaches. And it's definitely overwhelming. Again, fortunately, Choate, both with the coaching staffs, but you actually get dedicated guidance counselors. So there's a real system to help you manage all this stuff. But just letters coming in from anywhere, and then the phone starts to ring. Back then in the dorm, we had a payphone. And so there's
love that.
Yeah, there's just all these calls coming in all day, every day from these coaches. And so you're just trying to sort it out. And as a 17-year-old, it's heady stuff.
What were the schools that you really wanted to go to? Did you have an eye on, I guess, one, the schools, but two, were the schools that were interested looking at you for different sports, or was it football was the primary focus?
So it was both. And that summer I came back and I played in a showcase thing in Montreal that was set up by NHL Scouting. And so, again, it was, sort of one foot in both. I was definitely hoping for an opportunity to go to an Ivy League school. I mean, it's hard not to react when schools like that come calling, to think that you would actually get a chance to go to a place like that. And that was part of it too, was my game. I mean, you probably know it looking at me. My game was less about finesse on the hockey side. more about blunt instrument. I mean, I would describe myself as the Ogie Oglethorpe of the prep school league back then. And so that style of play was not necessarily going to translate as well to the college ranks. And what the scouts were telling me at that point was that if I wanted to keep playing hockey, I should come back and play in the Q and fight. And so when you started thinking about, 10-hour bus rides from Rimouski versus the chance to go play football at an Ivy League school, that certainly was part of, influenced the decision. But I was getting hockey interest too. Had gone and talked to the coaches, particularly at Yale and Dartmouth. Was not that into Yale, loved Dartmouth. I think that probably would have been my second choice. And yeah, it was just, again, trying to sort through all this stuff, but at the same time still playing rugby, the Quebec rugby team, and was talking to the guys on the national team. And so, I mean, it was certainly nice to have all these different options, but trying to sort through all that and do school and make sure that keeping up on sports and all that stuff, it was a lot to juggle, but somehow figured it out.
And what was the deciding factor about you going to Harvard then?
Just getting on the campus, like we talked about earlier. I was there 15, 20 minutes, and it was like, where do I sign? It was like, if I get a chance to go here, I'm all in.
So was it very much like starting over again? So you're a freshman at Harvard. Are you starting from square one? I mean, how does that work in the NCAA when you show up for a team?
So every time you move up a level, it's certainly my experience anyways. You can't believe how big and strong and fast the guys are there. And your initial reaction is, there's no way I'll ever play here.
Right.
like these guys are all too good. And that how I couldn't believe how good the guys were at prep school. Couldn't believe how good the guys were, when I got to Harvard. Couldn't believe how good the guys were when I got on the field of the CFL. The game slows down very quickly, and you just kind of figured it out. And so when I got to Harvard, the way you do it is they line up in their stretch lines, and you line up by position, and you line up by where you are in the depth chart. And so I started as a fullback on offense, and I think it was like 8th or 9th on the day. I was so far back in the stretch lines I couldn't even hear. The captain was at front leading, I couldn't even hear. And so same, you see 9 guys in front of you or whatever it was for some spot, and it's like, again, sort of day one, you're like, I don't know if this is ever going to work. And the way it just worked out, by week 2 I was starting. So it all moved really, really fast.
And what was your academics at Harvard? Because clearly, I mean, you say Harvard, everybody immediately thinks academics. So what was your undergrad program?
So at Harvard, you always got to be special. They don't have majors; they have concentrations.
Okay.
And so my concentration was English. Did sort of the traditional Bachelor of Arts curriculum. Did some extra economics courses because was thinking potentially about doing work in finance. I mean, that's, many of our grads go to New York when they graduate and go work in finance. I mean, it's a pretty established path, and so was certainly thinking about that. But that's not really the way it worked out. But, got to take some absolutely fantastic courses there that, really, really helpful in terms of thinking, helping you think critically, thinking about your own ethics. And obviously a wonderful place to develop academic interests. And that's probably the best part of being there, is the other people that you get to be around.
Did you get injured at all in college ball?
Got injured everywhere.
I'd be curious as to how you dealt with injuries. And I ask that because, and we'll probably get into this a little bit more when you transitioned out of pro sports, but I mean, so much of your identity is about your ability to play your sport. So how did you deal with injuries when you couldn't play your sport for a certain amount of time?
So I never had anything that kept me out for any substantial period of time. There's a couple of injuries that I remember very well, which is one, my senior year at Chode, I had a really bad, what they refer to now as the high ankle sprain. And I just didn't have any real explosiveness off my right foot, and my rushing stats for my junior year were better than my senior year stats. And I was still good enough to play, still good enough to be ahead of the guy behind me on the depth chart, but didn't quite perform at the level that I would have hoped going into that year. And you just got to power through it, and so challenging because your academic schedule at these schools are so full. Your athletic schedule is so full. I mean, you wake up in the morning, you're off to class, you're doing classes, and then you get to practice, and you do your practice, and you're trying to sleep well and eat well and do all these things that you need to do to keep yourself ready to perform. But then you're home and you got to do homework and essays, and making sure that you're on top of that and doing deadlines. So it definitely forces you to manage your time efficiently. And back to my grandmother, you don't have a whole heck of a lot of time to feel sorry for yourself, right? You just kind of power through it, and I mean, it's really interesting within the context of my work now with brain injury, but it was very helpful to learn how to play with injury. Now, brain injury, that's the exact opposite of what we want people to do, and we can talk about some of that later on. But resilience, as an athlete playing these sports, like you're never fully healthy, right? And so if you can't play through some pain and play through some injury, like you're not going to go very far. Now,
when you finished up at Harvard, what was What was the recruiting, or whatever the right term is, process? How was it different from moving from Choate to the NCAA and then the NCAA to pro sports? So what did that look like? So now you're graduated, you walk off with your Harvard degree. So what was that process like for you?
So I guess there are some similarities in that it bleeds into your senior spring and becomes a focus in your senior spring. So while a lot of my classmates at Harvard were partying and kind of getting ready for that next step, we were really deep into prepping for, they call it pro days. And so the way it works in football, and I guess the big difference there is there's just no academic component. Right. Other than taking what they call the Wonderlic test, which is this, sort of is there to measure your intellectual abilities. And so, I felt like I would do okay on that, right, as compared to most guys that were trying to play in the NFL and the CFL. But then, so you finish your season and then you start basically training almost like a track athlete, right? You're training for your 40 time, you're training for your vertical jump, you're training for your bench press test and all these standard tests that guys do in the football world that you still see today at the combine. And so you're doing that, you're trying to select an agent, you're trying to get yourself in front of teams, putting together your highlight tape. The guys come in from the there's a couple of different scouting services that come in and are doing background and information, and then you go and you start doing what's called pro days and combines. So for us, the big pro day in Boston was at Boston College, and so there were 20 teams there, and so you go and you work out, and fortunately there was kind of two tiers. They sort of do kind of something that's more open where the testing's limited, and then the guys they really want to look at, they bring in, they do a really detailed assessment. And so I was fortunate that I got invited to that, and so successfully got myself on some teams' radars. The Patriots had us come in because they're local, had us come in and work out individually for them, and then you do the CFL Combine. So it was like, my memory was that there's like 4 or 5 of these things over the course of 2 months, sort of starting in late February and right through into April. And then you go right into the drafts, right? And all the while, same thing where you're trying to finish up your degree. And I had an extra course to take that year. I had taken one course less in the fall to really be able to focus on football. And we had won the championship that year. We were the first team to go undefeated in the Ivy League. And that had been a real goal for all of us that had come in as freshmen, was that we wanted to win a championship before we left. And so we did that. But then the net was there was a lot more work to be done on the back end.
Right.
And so very difficult, rigorous academic schedule, the age-old trying to make sure you're also sleeping and eating properly and doing all that stuff as well to be able to go and train at the level that you were having to train to compete with these guys. And so it wasn't easy. I mean, the training center, there was a guy named Mike Boyle who was training us, and that training was 45 minutes away from Harvard. So the guy, I was very fortunate, my college roommate, a guy by the name of Jeff Compass, who ended up signing with New England and was absolutely phenomenal football player. Fortunately, he was doing that with me, and it was really helpful to have a training partner through that period. I think it would have been really hard to do on my own. And so our other roommate, who now actually is a medical director for the New York Knicks and works at Hospital for Special Service, a guy by the name of Mark Dracos, who's a phenomenal physician and very involved in the New York sports scene now. He would lend us his car, which was great. So we were able to drive out to this guy who's a phenomenal trainer, and he ended up doing a great job prepping. But that 45 minutes both ways, trying to do that again with school and making sure that one of the things I remember is the people in the dining hall, we were really tight with some of the people in the dining hall, and they would keep it open late for us. So because the timing of it, Jeff and I could just never make it back in time for dinner, and they would keep some food aside for us so that at least we could eat when we get back after training basically within an inch of our lives. I just remember being so physically tired and sore in that period, but we figured it out.
Were you ever concerned about not getting picked up by a team?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you always think about the downside. I mean, you're concerned with all these things, what if I don't make it? What if I don't get in? Like schools, it's what if? It's always the what if, right? I think everybody has those doubts. And it's one of the things you got to overcome from a resilience standpoint, right? Is just to push through that.
And what team did you eventually end up playing your first sort of pro game for?
So Hamilton drafted me. I mean, it all ended up working out really well. Hamilton drafted me, and having grown up listening, to my dad, having been, the Heck Creighton Trophy winner for the top football player in Canada. It's like, how do you actually top that? And so when I got to call him from Winnipeg, because Hamilton had came and seen me right after the combine and had basically said, look, we're thinking pretty strongly about picking you. And it was Ron Lancaster, right, legendary coach, guy I'd watched on TV growing up, and all of a sudden he's sitting in front of you saying, I think we want you. It's a pretty cool feeling. So called my dad from the hotel room and said, hey, guess what? I'm going to be the first overall draft pick. And so felt like finally I could sit at the table and look him in the eye.
And what was walking on the field that first game like?
Unbelievable. So the Ticats picked me. You go to training camp. Let me tell you, the difference between going from Harvard to training camp with the Ticats, particularly with that crew, and so some of the guys that were on that defense were Lamar McGriggs and Orlando Steinauer, who's now the coach over in Hamilton, and Mike Philbrick and Calvin Tagle, and it felt like being in a Pulp Fiction movie. Like, these guys are just like characters. I mean, I've never felt so safe in my life as rolling around with those guys. Big, strong, funny guys. It was definitely very, very different, but absolutely wonderful. I mean, it felt like a dream. And so we had our preseason game. I think our first preseason game was in Winnipeg, and got to play a lot in that game. I remember Grant Carter. I go out for my first punt, and I come firing off the line at Grant. Grant was an all-star player, and he was blocking me. And he did a veteran trick where he grabs you under the shoulder pads and then yanks. So, of course, I go right down flat on my face. And then he chased me down and got me at the end of the play, got a good whacking on me on the end of the play, and, used some colorful language and then called me Harvard boy. I remember that. So that was a welcome to the CFL moment. And the first regular season game we played in Calgary on Canada Day, and they flew the jets over the stadium, which, if you've ever experienced that, I mean, your adrenaline just courses through you, and it just surges. You feel like your head's going to pop off. You're so fired up. And we were playing Jeff Garcia, and I got in on the rotation on defense and hit an inside move on a guy who was an all-star, and hit Jeff as he was throwing the ball. And I just, again, it felt like a dream. I just couldn't believe I was there.
I think, you have a lot of experience with winning. And so you've won how many Grey Cups?
4.
Each with a different team?
Each with a different team.
Is there anybody else who has done that in CFL history?
No, I was the first guy.
Okay. So you've got a lot of experience with winning. And we can talk about that, but I'm always interested in adversity and how dealing with a bad season or a particular bad loss. Is there a particular point in your career in the CFL where it sticks with you about how difficult it was to sort of navigate through those moments of loss or whatever it was, because those got you to these four Grey Cups?
So I blew my shoulder in '99. I blew it in the first game, and had to get surgery and was out for the year. Anytime you get a season-ending injury, I think you always question whether or not you're going to be able to make it back, whether you're going to be the same. And it's a long road, and you ask yourself questions. Is this really what I want to do? But you said it. It's just this constant overcoming of adversity, and I mean, it's funny that you say that. You're not the first person to say it, and when I look back, I mean, it's probably the thing about my athletic resume that's the most interesting is, at Selwyn House, we won football championships. We won the city and the provincial championship in hockey. We won New England's in football both years I was at Cho. We won the Ivies at Harvard, and we're the first team to go undefeated or untied in the Ivies in Harvard history, and then the Grey Cups. But it didn't feel like this ride where everything was going right the whole time. It actually felt exactly the opposite.
Right.
It felt like you're constantly on the precipice of failure and difficulty, and it's hard, right? The day-to-day is usually hard, right? And not always fun, right? There's wonderful moments, but there's a lot of grind there. And you never get to a positive outcome if you don't have that.
What was the catalyst for you deciding that you were going to leave pro sports? You're going to end your football career?
My heart wasn't in it anymore. It was I was in Saskatchewan, and it was my 10th year. I wasn't playing as much anymore, and I'd just been doing it for so long. And it's interesting how that we were talking about that earlier. How something that you love so much and was your dream can end up being where it's just not fun and you don't want to do it anymore. And we change, right? We evolve as we age. We get different interests. And I knew, you always hate training camp. Training camp's miserable, and it's physically painful. I'm sure it's like basic training for you. It's like you suffer, right? It's something you suffer through to get through to the other stuff. So I always hated training camp. Practices started to become a real drag, but I really knew I was done when I wasn't excited for games anymore. And football is one of those games. If you're not doing it 100%, you're going to get hurt. If you're going at 99 or 98% at that level. And so it was totally out of my heart. But you know what? I'm very thankful for that. Most guys I played with, many of the guys that I managed from an agent standpoint, end up leaving the game wanting one more game, one more year, one more this, one more that. And I would always tell the guys that I managed, I said, I want nothing more from you that you play where it's not in your heart anymore, because it makes it so easy to walk away. And feel very, very fortunate that I was able to walk away feeling like I had done everything I needed to do with it and just having no regrets, because I think most people actually have the opposite.
I think one of we've talked about this before, Tim, and the number of sort of parallels between being in the military and being in sport. And I'm curious if there's ever any discussions in sport about life after sport, about transitioning out of sport. And I say that because I think that the military is really immature in this subject in terms of if you're going to leave. There are some leaders out there who are really good at mentoring and sort of listening to people who want to leave and then congratulating them and supporting that transition. But I would say that most are not, and it's quite immature that when dealing with that subject. How is it in sports? Is there anybody, or is there even a culture of wanting to help prepare people for after the game?
So I think that's really evolved since I went in as a rookie. And I remember one of the veterans telling me as a rookie, there was some other thing I was talking about, I don't know, side business or doing outreach or whatever it was. And he talked about it distracting from focus. And I think that mentality has changed quite a bit. And I think there was a lot of attention that went to athletes that had struggled financially once they had retired. And so all of a sudden it wasn't cool anymore to not have yourself set up for after sports. And, thinking a little bit about how media has changed, where, when a guy retires, it used to be they would just kind of disappear from the media. And now, because of social media and that kind of thing, you can follow a retired players,
right?
Right, and so you can see when there's a difficult transition, and it's now become cool for athletes to be, in business and doing investments and preparing themselves for life after football. Like, if you don't do that, you're stupid. You're not
right.
You're not
paying attention.
You're not doing what you need to do, and I think that's changed in the time. I think in a very positive way. And I think it used to be the ethos was that you should just be totally consumed by your sport and just spend all your time and all your energy doing that. And I don't think people think that way anymore. And like I said, I think, a lot of these top athletes, they do a lot more than just play sports, right? And so I think that's certainly filtered down. I think the parallels between the military and sports are incredible. And we've talked about this a lot. There's huge respect within the athlete community for military. And the way I always talk about it is we'd play the military appreciation games in the CFL, and they'd always bring, some military guys through the locker room before the game. We'd all sit up straighter. And I think it was always, there goes the real badasses. Like what we do was a game, and what you guys did was for real. And I think there was always just deep respect for that. So when I talk to athletes about the brain injury issue and the stuff that we're doing now, a lot of times I reference what the military guys are doing. But then the funny thing is it actually works in reverse, where if I'm talking to military guys, a lot of times I talk about what the athlete's doing, because I think there's just tremendous mutual respect there.
And how was your, guess maybe a two-parter on transition. So one, how was your transition? And two, were there certain sort of skills, superpowers that you didn't get to exercise as an athlete that now you got to actually work those muscles more?
The transition's tough. I don't care how prepared you are for it. I think it's going to be tough, even in my case where I was ready to go. And the way I've always talked about that, and again, tried to coach so many of the players that I represented as an agent through that, is when somebody leaves university or goes into the workforce as a young person, it's very common. People almost expect that they're going to try 2 or 3 or 4 things and have some failures. When you're leaving sports as somebody who's in their mid-30s, that's not as cool and not as accepted.
Right.
And so my path was I was well set up coming out of it. I had a job lined up, which I did for a year before doing the agent stuff, but sort of did a hard right on that one, where the gentleman who was my agent all tenure, a guy by the name of Gil Scott, who's one of the most respected Canadian football and hockey agents, asked me to come on as his partner. And so had never thought about doing that, was certainly not a goal, and then ended up, taking Gil up after, working on doing something else in the first year and just trying it very much in the background. Gil was smart. He said, just, you don't have to commit now, just try it and see how it goes. And it went well. A lot of my former teammates, signed up as clients, and a year later decided to do it full time.
And what sort of part of your, your skill sets, your character, did you get to exercise in your role as an agent that maybe you didn't get to work out so much as a pro athlete?
So I think maybe less in my agent work, but more in my consulting work, because I did a lot of sports consulting work. And I think understanding what we talked about earlier, of that feeling of what it takes to or what it should feel like in a team that's going to win. And for all the different championship teams that I played on, it was always very different, the way the chemistry actually got set up, but the feeling was always the same. And it was this feeling of trust and belief. And so going into organizations as a consultant and helping them trying to get on that path, I think that understanding and that experience of having worked to try and unify locker rooms and people from very different backgrounds with very different agendas, very strong personalities and trying to figure out that commonality of how to work together. I think that is probably the biggest takeaway. And what you asked earlier about in terms of a superpower, although I'm not sure it's necessarily a superpower, where I think it's more a blessing of, this wonderful experience I had going to all these incredible schools, play on all these incredible teams with these, really like these top athletes, is just knowing what it should feel like when you're going to win, and helping people work towards putting those pieces of the puzzle together in a way that gets you to that feeling. And when you get it and when you have it, it's magic. And so I think knowing what the end result should feel like, taste like, I think that's the greatest thing that I've been able to take. And that's not something that's come from inside me necessarily. I think that's the blessing of the great privilege that I've had of going to these schools and playing on these teams and ultimately being surrounded by the people that I've been surrounded by in my life. Going back to my parents and my family.
How did the concussion charity piece come into your life then?
So as I started the agent work, was Chris Nowinski, who was my college teammate at Harvard, also played defensive line, was 2 years younger than me. And Chris and I weren't super tight. I mean, we were friends, but we weren't super tight in college. And at the Harvard-Yale game the year before I retired, he had come and put his book in my hand. And Chris had a very unique path. He went and wrestled in the WWE. And even though wrestling's fake, and I hate to ruin that for your listeners, but Chris had gotten, I mean, what they do is very physical. And Chris had gotten hit in the head one too many times and was suffering from post-concussion syndrome, didn't know it, went and saw a specialist, was trying to figure out what was wrong with him, and ended up in Bob Cantu's office, who's one of the top physicians in the world when it comes to looking at brain injuries. And Bob asked him the question, said, have you ever experienced headaches, seeing stars, being dizzy, having balance? And Chris said, well, yeah, like all the time. Like that's just kind of part of it. And Bob said, well, those are all concussions and you're suffering from post-concussion syndrome. And Chris was shocked and went out and did a bunch of work and a bunch of research. Chris is a very smart guy and put together this book that basically identified there was this hidden epidemic of brain injury happening right under our noses in elite sports. And so I read the book.
What's the book called?
Head Games.
Okay.
And they ended up making it into a documentary, which is also worth watching. And so I was very moved by what Chris had put together. Certainly relevant to my life, and then was even more relevant to the fact that I was signing up all these guys as their agent, saying I was going to take care of them and take care. And so I figured that it was incumbent on me to be up to speed so I've had a front row seat of all the work that's been done in Boston that's gotten so much media attention on brain injury. I've been there almost from the beginning and gotten to watch it progress. So started working with Chris formally on the U.S. side in 2009, set up the paperwork for the not-for-profit here in Canada, because we certainly had a similar need in 2012, and we got our charitable status 2014. And it was very much my background work, very much my charitable work. But as our understanding of just how pervasive the issue has grown, it's also grown in terms of how much of my time that I spend with it.
What are some of the challenges about running a not-for-profit in Canada? So what are the things that sort of keep you up at night? Because I think a lot of Canadians just see sort of the door knocking, or they see the social media, but they really don't have much of an understanding about how much work it maybe is to not only establish it, but to run one of these organizations.
So I mean, funding's your number one challenge in resources, right? And so it's great to have a good mission. It's great to have a bunch of people that care about what you're trying to do. But if you can't facilitate, if you don't have the resources to facilitate it, you're not going to go very far. And so that was always a challenge, because people don't want to fund something that is not up and running. So,
right.
You're very much always stuck with that chicken and egg. And so, you've basically got to kind of will it through that period. And look, there was lots of stuff where if I couldn't find funding for something, I just reached in my own pocket. And fortunately, I was, had the resources to be able to do that. And just a lot of time and effort, blood, sweat, and tears. And we've pushed on it very hard. And, it's like they talk about it takes 10 years to build an overnight success. Well, here we are.
Right. How did the Project Enlist piece get added to the effort? Is this in the U.S. as well?
Yeah. So when we set up the brain bank down in Boston, it used to be the BUCLF VA brain bank. So there was a direct tie to the Veteran Affairs down there, and so I think there was always an intent to look at the military, and so. When the first 102 brains that were autopsied by Anne McKee in her brain at what's now called the Unite Brain Bank out of Boston University, 66 came back positive for CT, which I think was a bigger number than maybe some of us had anticipated. But it's just clear that, a lot of the brain injury issues that the athletes have faced are also being faced by folks in the military.
Maybe just a quick sort of, if you can explain exactly, what a brain bank is, what the objective of it is, and then maybe a little bit on sort of CTE 101 just for the listener.
Yeah, so unfortunately, chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a degenerative brain disease that's caused by repetitive head impacts. In the military, it's can be. I mean, people have looked and thought a lot about blast, but in talking to you guys, I mean, it happens all over the place. Think the recoil from firing a piece of heavy artillery, the paratroopers, which naively I thought those guys used to kind of float down, but as you guys well know, you got to come down pretty fast or you get shot, and so it sounds like. Those guys have told me it's like jumping out of a second-story window every time, and it sounds like probably those guys get concussed every time they hit the ground, quite frankly.
Right.
I've heard some horrific stories about the jumping there, even rolling around in the back of a tank, the shaking, being near some of the cannons. Guys talk about, well, I felt like my head got blown off just sort of being in the proximity of that stuff. And then I hear intramural sports get pretty rough and competitive.
They have their
right?
moments.
And of course, these are lots of guys that had played sports, right? That had grown up, playing sports like soccer and hockey and football, where brain injuries are happening. And so when you look at those cumulative head impacts, if you look at somebody who's had a sports career and has been exposed and then goes into the military and then get exposed through the training as well. And listen, we've seen guys with no sports background that have tested positive for these things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be with guys coming from a sports background, but it's associated. So CT is associated with issues like executive function issues, dementia, mental health issues. We think it's probably bigger part of the PTSD conversation than anybody realizes is brain injury, and so it's something that we want to pursue. We talked earlier about athletes and our respect for military people, and I feel strongly that when somebody's served, we want to make sure that we take care of those guys when they come back and help them out with these issues, and so that's a big part of our day-to-day. We have 2 veterans on our staff, Ryan Carey and Mike Terry, and those guys have been phenomenal in engaging the veteran community.
And so can you give us a bit of a sense of the importance of a brain bank?
Yeah, so a brain bank, when you talk about it from a research standpoint, so CT or chronic traumatic encephalopathy can only be diagnosed right now by autopsy. And so when somebody passes away, you actually have to take the brain, do an autopsy, and look for the prevalence of tau protein. And brain banks are very common when you look at any and all things brain disease. where when somebody passes away, some section of the brain is removed and is stored for research purposes. And so there's lots of brain banks all over the world at many of the top universities that are looking at all these things.
And what's the intent of this legislation that you're sort of up on the Hill, talking about and trying to get this advanced?
So we look at a national strategy on brain injury, and just for reference, so there is concussion legislation in all 50 states. The only place we've done that in Canada is in Ontario with Rowan's Law, and worked on that with Lisa MacLeod, the MPP from Nepean in the Ottawa area. Gordon, Kathleen Stringer were constituents of Lisa's, and for those who don't know, Rowan was a 17-year-old rugby player that had a series of concussions and tried to play through it and passed away from second impact syndrome, which is rare but does happen, particularly with teenagers. And so part of her legacy is that Gordon, Kathleen, and her sister Cassie went to Lisa MacLeod, and they were able to put through this legislation in Ontario. And I think it's something really important to look at, both at the federal level, but for the other provinces as well.
Yeah, this clearly is, I think, a level of a discussion that needs to be had, and awareness that parents need to have, and athletes need to have. And you're in a unique position. So not only are you running a concussion charity in Canada, you're a pro athlete, but you're also you're a parent yourself with 3 boys. So what advice would you give to parents that are trying to navigate wanting the benefit of the sports, fitness, teamwork for the children, but being concerned about CTE?
So sports are wonderful. Our messaging, we are not discouraging sports participation in any way, shape, or form. It's the opposite. We're encouraging sports participation. The wonderful benefit there, wonderful opportunity for personal development. What needs to happen from a policy standpoint is to not expose kids, particularly under the age of 12, to repetitive head impacts. So think heading in soccer, think tackling in football. Fortunately, Hockey Canada, shortly after the Sidney Crosby concussion, raised the age of body checking in hockey. But really, any place where kids are exposed to repetitive head impacts. So from a sport perspective, my kid, I'll speak for my kids, and I've got 8-year-old Dougie, 6-year-old Solomon, and 2-year-old Abraham, and they all came out of the womb contact sports athletes. Like, they are high energy, physical kids. Doug and Solly both play hockey, but no heading in soccer. Right, and unfortunately, like, the U.S. has banned that under the age of 12 since 2015. The U.K. Restricted headers for youth a couple of years ago, and so far, unfortunately, in Canada, we haven't done anything. So that's one of the big things we want to see from a policy change standpoint, is not exposing kids to headers. And then my kids are playing flag football, and if they choose, and I just want them to be happy. I want them to do whatever they want. There's no pressure on them at all. But if they want to play, they can play later in life when they're teenagers, when their bodies have matured and they're more able to withstand the impacts. And then even when that happens, you got to make sure that you got a coach that's going to minimize hitting in practice. It's Ken Dryden said it very well. He says, a hit to the head is never a good thing. And so for coaches everywhere, the big message is there's going to be hits in football. There's going to be body checking in hockey. There's going to be tackling in rugby. And there's going to be some form of heading in soccer. But I think we all need to be working together in the sports community to minimize those things. Right? And if somebody... what our data shows is that for a kid who started playing football at 5 years old versus a kid who started at 14-year-old, the 5-year-old is 10 times more likely to develop CTE. So in so long as you're not exposing your children to head impacts, and I think the magic number is certainly 12 years old, but we recommend 14 just to be on the safe side. And I think there probably does need to be some sort of gradual introduction to contact. It's actually one of the projects that I'm working on right now is what that would look like. But that's my big advice to parents, is by all means have your kids participate in these sports. just don't expose them too early to head impacts. And then once they are teenagers, make sure that those coaches aren't exposing them to excess impacts that are unnecessary.
What would success look like 5 years from now on this issue, both on the sports side and the military side?
So there's a couple of different things. The first thing is that we've asked people in the sports community and the military community to pledge to donate their brains, and whether they have issues or not. And especially if they don't have issues, because so many of the people that we've studied do have issues, and we need to study more football players that don't have CT and try to figure out why that is. We need to try and understand. I mean, certainly we've seen it on the U.S. side, and I think we're very close to being able to autopsy some Canadian service members to look to see whether they have the brain disease. Until you actually do it by autopsy and find it, you can't say it definitively. I think we'll certainly be surprised if it's not the case. Having listened to the symptomology of some of the cases of the people that we've been talking to. But I think, continuing to advance that research, our research group at CAMH is doing PET scans. And so, and they're about to start first in human trials, looking at a radio tracer that seems to be able to, that it will show CT in some of these PET scans that they're about starting to do. So really starting to be able to diagnose CT in vivo, but starting to get a real sense of the true prevalence of this brain disease in athletes that have been exposed to repetitive head impacts, in the military community, people, violence survivors, accident survivors, and getting sense of just how prevalent this brain disease is. I think looking at, we know about concussion, we know about CT, but I think there's more to the story than that. What else is out there? What else is happening to the brain as a result of head impacts, and continuing to further that research. So for anybody that's listening, particularly in the military, through Project Enlist, they can go to projectenlist.ca and pledge to donate their brain. We've already had 400 military service members do so, which is very, very helpful as we look to continue this research, but also to show to people on Parliament Hill and other decision makers that this is an issue that's important to people. And so that support works very well for us. We also have a helpline in case somebody's suffering from issues. And so I think people understanding, because a lot of times brain injuries go unrecognized and undiagnosed. So I think, anytime somebody has an accident, a big fall, is showing issues or having mental health issues, I think the question always needs to be asked is there a brain injury? And just having people really starting to think that way, both in the general population, but also healthcare providers. Because if it is, it's a different treatment strategy on the back end. And so, again, if anybody's struggling with issues, if they're struggling with mental health issues, struggling with PTSD, or anything that can be dementia, anything that's associated with brain injury, or for their caregivers too, because there's often huge burden on the caregivers with this. They can come in through our helpline and we'll connect them with the best medical resources available based on their geographic area. So you can get that at our website. It's concussionfoundation.ca. And so I think, having people signing up and being part of research, having people be more educated on this issue and starting to recognize and properly diagnose and properly treat those brain injuries that we know are happening, but just actually, catching them, and then having this patient navigation service where, we're doing a better job connecting people to the proper and available medical resources to dealing with these things. And then finally training healthcare professionals, because the science has evolved so fast that many healthcare professionals are not up to the latest and greatest in terms of the best way to manage these injuries. So I think if we're doing all those different things, getting people more educated, continuing to advance the research, doing a better job connecting people with the proper medical treatment resources, and then educating healthcare professionals, I think that's what success looks like. And I'm hopeful that in 5 years we'll be well down the road of doing that. I really am.
Unfortunately, I got to cut it there, Tim, because we got to get you back up on Parliament Hill for your next engagement with a member of Parliament. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and all the work you're doing on this issue, and for being one of our Northern Sentinels. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
You can find information in the show notes on the Heck Crichton Trophy, Tim's football career, and the Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.